Hey friends, this is our gospel text right over here for this week, Luke 9:28 to 43. But I want to come back to that in just a moment. This is the passage that's sort of commonly known as the Transfiguration, in which Peter, James, and John are with Jesus on the mountain, and they have this experience where they see Jesus transfigured before them. He's transformed into kind of his divine or glorious presence before them. So I'm going to come back to this passage in particular in just a moment, but this whole section of what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? Synoptic because they have a similar view of things. Um, this passage is really critical in all three of these gospels, and so that's why I've laid them side by side here and made some, highlighting of what they have in common and what's different about each one of them. By the way, I'll be scrolling up and down through this document, so I'll load this on the Canvas page as well, so you can access this document if you want to be able to look at this at your own speed. But like I said, this particular moment in all three of these Gospels, in which Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John, and just before that, Peter makes his confession of Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, is really central in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I wanted to lay them side by side and really treat this passage as a whole because I don't, and it is rather lengthy. Like I'm doing a lot of sort of context around the passage for this week here, but I think you really can't understand the significance of what's happening in this particular text, chapter 9, verse 28 to 43, without kind of looking at these three passages side by side in these three Gospels and getting a sense of how they all fall together. So first, let me just give you a sense of like why these passages are so important in each of these Gospels. First of all, in the Gospel of Mark, which, by the way, if you don't already know, most scholars, are quite confident that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them when they're writing their gospel. And this is actually one of the passages where you can really see why that is, because you can see pretty clearly that Matthew and Luke are both kind of generally following Mark's order. In a lot of cases, these in Greek, a lot of these pieces can be almost word for word the same. So it's not even like that they're just recounting the same story, right? I mean, when it's almost word for word the same, uh, somebody's copying somebody, right? I mean, I would always joke when I would teach about this idea in my classes at ENC that I'd just say to the students, like, hey, if I have two of your papers and one of them has multiple paragraphs that are word for word the same as another student's, what conclusion am I going to come to, right? Like it's not rocket science to figure out that if you have that much similarity, somebody copied from somebody. And I could get into a lot more, reasons why Mark is thought to be first and all that. I won't do that in this video because there's already plenty to talk about here. But most scholars believe that Mark was the earliest gospel and that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them when they're writing their gospel, and then they add some of their own material to that, and we'll see that a little bit in this passage. So I just want to start with why this is so critical to the Gospel of Mark, since Matthew and Luke kind of follow him in many ways. In Mark's Gospel, this Mark 8:27 to 9:32, which is the parallel to what we're dealing with in Luke, is is really the very center of Mark's Gospel. It's at the very heart of it. I mean, you think Mark is 16 chapters, right? So chapter 8 is roughly in the middle. But more than that, there's another piece that draws this together and really makes it clear that this is at the really at the center, at the heart of Mark's gospel, and that is in the passage that we're going to deal with for this week. That is, and we'll come to this in more detail in just a minute, but you see that all three gospels have this voice from heaven that says, "This is my son, whom I dearly love." Right? So you right here. Oops, what did I do? Uh, let's get back to that. Sorry. Um, so Oh, here we go. Okay. So right here in the Gospel of Matthew, here in Mark, and um, well, let's see, did I lose it in Luke? Oh, and then here it is in the Gospel of Luke. That in each of these Gospels, this voice from heaven speaks and says, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. I'm very pleased with him. Listen to him." That's really significant because, especially in Mark's gospel, because that same, uh, virtually that same sentence appears in two other places. You may remember that one is at the beginning of Mark's gospel at Jesus' baptism, that the voice, when the Spirit descends on him like a dove, the voice from heaven says these same words. And by the way, these are the words of Psalm 2. This is a quotation from the second Psalm. "This is my son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." Um, so it happens in the Gospel of Mark at Jesus' baptism. And it also happens a little bit of a different way at Jesus' crucifixion, that the Roman centurion says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And so those in Mark's gospel in particular, Matthew and Luke both have the quotation of Psalm 2 at Jesus' baptism, but they don't have the other bookend at Jesus' crucifixion. And so in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' baptism and Jesus' crucifixion are really sort of bookends, in a number of ways that, again, I won't get into this video because there's already too much to talk about here. But Jesus' baptism and Jesus' crucifixion are really sort of bookends to the Gospel of Mark, and they both involve this confession of Jesus as God's Son, the same confession that you have here at the Transfiguration. And so this really is, in many ways, the center of Mark's Gospel, that it's sort of like, hey, pay attention, like, we're cluing you into the structure of the gospel, as a literary whole, that what we're discussing in this passage is quite literally central. It's right in the middle, and it's kind of like, if you want to understand the heart of what it means to be Jesus' disciple, this is a good passage to pay attention to. And so I think that's also true in different ways in Matthew and Luke. It is not the literary center of Matthew and Luke in the way that it is at Mark, and you don't have exactly those same bookends in Matthew and Luke that you have in Mark. But nonetheless, there are other things that set this passage apart as critically important in Matthew and Luke as well. In Luke, what really sets this passage apart is something that comes near the end of the chapter, in verse 51, so well after the passage we're dealing with today, but nonetheless in the same chapter, it says, "As the time approached when Jesus was to be taken up into heaven, he determined to go to Jerusalem." And scholars will cite this as important in the structure of Luke's gospel because basically from chapter 9, verse 51, until the end of the gospel, Jesus is essentially on the way to Jerusalem. And so the majority of Luke's gospel happens as this kind of journey toward Jerusalem. He's always sort of on his way to Jerusalem from chapter 9 on. So even though this is not the center of Luke's gospel in the way that it is in Mark, there is still this significant turn in the text of like, okay, right after Jesus has this conversation that we're going to look at in chapter 9 here, he's on his way to Jerusalem. And that's actually really significant for what we're going to talk about because what's going to happen in Jerusalem? Yeah, he's going to be taken up into heaven, as this verse says, but what does that mean? He's going to be crucified, right? And that's actually, his suffering and death is central to the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about this story, this transfiguration. So it's really significant that Jesus on the way to Jerusalem, on the way to his suffering and death. In Matthew's gospel, and I won't spend too much time on this because we are dealing with Luke, obviously, but I'll just point out, sorry about that, point out really quickly here that in Matthew's gospel, you'll notice what I've highlighted in yellow here. This is only in Matthew, this section. You'll see that I've left that blank in Mark and Luke because that's not there. And this is the passage where after Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, Jesus says, yeah, blessed are you, Simon, because men didn't reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And then this is where he says, I tell you, you are Peter, right? Which Petros in Greek means rock. And I'll build my church on this rock. So it's a play on this name that he's giving him. The gates of the underworld won't be able to stand against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Anything you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven. Anything you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. So there's this significant moment where, well, in all these Gospels, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, but Matthew then adds this piece to say, hey, this is really important, right? Like he's Jesus is saying, I'm building my church on Peter, on this rock, Petros, and sort of, in a sense, handing the keys of the kingdom over to Peter, in a sense. So, all that to say that this passage that we're going to look at now is so important to understanding the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke each tell their story of Jesus, even though they each tell it in a little bit of a different way. So with that, let's start to dive in here. And I'm going to focus on the Lucan text over here on the right, since that is, the lectionary text for this week. So uh, once when Jesus was praying by himself, the disciples joined him and asked them, who do the crowds say that I am? They answered, John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others that one of the ancient prophets has come back to life. By the way, just a historical note, like this makes complete sense that the people would perceive Jesus as a prophet. I mean, everything the Gospels tell us about him, even though, of course, we know, and we'll hear in this passage, we come to confess him as Christ or Messiah, uh, the kinds of things that Jesus is doing in his ministry, the kinds of things that other people would have seen him do, are exactly the kinds of things that Elijah, Elisha, the other prophets, right, even John the Baptist, did in their ministry. So, just as a kind of historical note, not at all surprising that this is how the crowds would perceive Jesus is as a prophet. Um, so Jesus asked them, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, the Christ sent from God. Just a quick note here, in case you don't already know, that this word Christ, Christos in Greek, is kind of the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah or Meshiach, which literally means anointed one. It means being anointed with oil. And so in the Old Testament, people can be anointed with oil for different tasks. It's a sort of sign that they've been set apart by the Spirit of God for specific tasks. So a king might be anointed with oil. A priest might be anointed with oil. I think there might even be occasions where prophets are anointed with oil. But it comes to represent specifically this idea of a deliverer, right? The Messiah is the one who is expected to deliver God's people. And so when Peter says in all three of these Gospels, you're the Christ sent from God, you're the Messiah, Peter almost certainly has certain expectations connected with that, right? Expectations that would not be unlike uh, King David, right? What you'd expect from King David, this sort of conquering hero, this warrior, this sort of warrior king, right? Who unifies Israel and makes them independent, makes them a nation, and even expands their power to some degree. And that there's this sense in which David and by extrapolation to some extent, all the kings of Israel are sort of God's right hand man, right? Like you really see this in Psalm 110 or Psalm 72, for example, that the kings of Israel are the ones who are to enact God's righteousness on earth. And so when Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, he probably has certain expectations about how that will be enacted with power in this world. So, given that expectation, it's really significant what Jesus says next, right? Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell this to anyone. Well, that's interesting, right? If he was going to be a king, you might think you want to announce it. And then he goes on to say, he said, the human one, or the Son of Man, as this is the Common English Bible I'm working from, the Son of Man, as some translations have it, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the legal experts, and be killed and be raised on the third day. So the thing we need to notice here is that is immediately contrary to what Peter's expectation would have been, right? He's just proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the conquering king who's going to deliver Israel. And the very next thing that Jesus talks about is his suffering and death. I cannot emphasize strongly enough how central I think this is to understanding Matthew, Mark, and Luke's portrayal of Jesus. um, that that he is expected as a conquering hero, and the very next thing that Jesus talks about is his own suffering and death. And in Matthew and Luke, you can see in this section here that I've highlighted in blue, in Matthew and Luke, you see the tension. Sorry, in Matthew and Mark, Luke sort of drops the tension out a little bit. You see this section is missing from Luke, but Matthew and Mark really highlight the tension for us because Jesus starts talking about his suffering death, and Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Right? He's like, Jesus, you can't be talking that way. You can't be saying these kind of things. I just said you were the Christ. I just said you were the Messiah. You can't be talking about your suffering. And so he takes Jesus aside and rebukes Jesus and be like, no, Jesus, you're doing this whole Messiah thing wrong. But then Jesus turned and looked at his disciples and sternly corrected Peter, and he says, get behind me, Satan. Wow. I mean, that's a strong admonition, right? Like, really, there's probably, I mean, for all the terrible things that Jesus says about the religious leaders in some of the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, or Luke as well, uh, there's really nothing quite like this one. I mean, he doesn't typically go around calling people Satan. But he says to Peter, one of his own disciples, get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. So Matthew and Mark make it abundantly clear that Jesus is having none of this, right? That Peter misunderstands, like, yes, Peter's right that Jesus is the Christ, but Peter misunderstands what that means. That Peter thinks for him to be the Messiah is to be this conquering hero. And we'll see in just a minute here in Luke, there is a sense in which Jesus is a kind of conquering hero, but definitely not in the way that Peter expects and that the disciples probably expect and that probably much of Israel expects, right? Um, but that instead he's going to be a conquering hero through his own suffering and death, not through wielding a sword. And this is just one of the most, maybe the most important points, really in these gospels, is this tension between, yeah, Jesus is the Christ, but the way that he's going to be the Christ is through his own suffering and death. And so immediately after he rebukes Peter in Matthew and Mark, then we see he goes into more detail and says, and this is here in Luke as well, you see right here, this parallel passage with the others, um, and it's not only Jesus who's going to suffer, but here's this critical text, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me will save them. What advantage do people have if they gain the whole world for themselves, yet perish or lose their lives? So you can read the rest of that. But I mean, it's such a critical piece when we think about what does it mean to be a disciple? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? That right here, literally at the center of Mark's gospel, and in these two really important places in Matthew and Luke's gospel, Jesus saying, you want to be my disciple? Take up your cross daily and follow me. And of course, that is so much of the message of the season of Lent. Okay, so we've kind of set the scene here. So, but it's important now that Peter, James, and John are going to have this sort of transformative moment, this highly spiritual moment where Jesus is transfigured before them into something resembling his kind of divine being. Uh, but it's really important that we understand that this is happening right after Jesus has just talked about his own suffering and death, and right after saying that anybody who wants to be his disciple has to take up their cross and follow him. And so, with that, we get into the text for this week. About 8 days, and by the way, you just noticed that Matthew and Mark both have 6 days. I don't, know if there's a huge significance to that. Although, of course, you think about like 7 days in the week, right? 6 days God creates. On the seventh day, God rests. So an eighth day maybe begins a new week, and maybe there's something that Luke is doing there with, hey, what's about to happen is the beginning of something new. Anyway, about 8 days after Jesus said these things, he took Peter, John, and James and went up on a mountain to pray. Which, by the way, we should just note, going up on a mountain, if we've read our Old Testament, or in Jesus' day, the Bible, right? Uh, if we've read those stories, if we're going up on a mountain, we might anticipate something significant's about to happen, right? Moses going up on the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments, things like that, right? So they go up on a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes flashed white like lightning. So there's this sort of transformative experience that there's some sense in which his divine being is sort of shining through in some way. uh, Two men, Moses and Elijah, were talking with him. So Moses and Elijah both have their own sort of significant mountaintop, experiences with God. But I think also we should note here, like these are, arguably the two most significant Old Testament figures. At the very least, Moses can kind of represent the law here, while Elijah represents the prophets. So there's a sense in which like this is who Jesus belongs with, right? He belongs next to these really significant prophets, Moses and Elijah. They were clothed with heavenly splendor. By the way, you'll notice I've highlighted this in green because this section is only in Luke, not there in Matthew and Mark. They were clothed with heavenly splendor and spoke about Jesus's departure, which he would achieve in Jerusalem. I want to hone in on that word departure for just a minute here, right here. Um, The Greek word here is ex hodos. It's literally sort of the preposition for out, and hodos, which is the word for way. So it's a way out, right? And so departure is a possible translation. Talking about Jesus' departure, you could say his exit, right? His leaving. But you may have noticed that that word exodos sounds a little bit like another word you might know, the word exodus, which of course it's the same word actually. I mean, that is the Greek name for the second book of the Bible, Exodus, because God makes a way out of Egypt for the descendants of Abraham, right? But I'm always sort of puzzled by how many translations choose to translate this as Jesus' departure when it seems clear to me that there's so much more meaning here that we might notice if the translators would translate this for us as, Moses and Elijah spoke about Jesus' exodus, which he was about to achieve in Jerusalem. And this really ties into so many themes in the Gospel of Luke that so much of what Jesus is doing, really in all the Gospels, but Luke highlights it in some ways that the other Gospels don't even, is that Jesus' ministry is about creating this new exodus, this new deliverance. So, as I was saying before, Jesus is a deliverer. He is a kind of conquering hero, but in a really ironic, upside down kind of way, right? He's not wielding a sword and leading the people against the Romans. But instead, through his suffering and death and resurrection, the Gospel of Luke is claiming, he is accomplishing a new kind of exodus, a new redemption of the people of Israel, a new delivering of people from their slavery and oppression. And so, wow, I mean, it's just, there's so much here to think about that, that Jesus is going to Jerusalem, which we already said that's where he's headed at the end of this chapter, right? Jesus is going to Jerusalem to accomplish this exodus, this exodos, this new redemption of the people of Israel. So there's just, I think, as a preacher or a teacher or however you're discussing this, there's lots of things to play with there as you think about the Exodus, the new Exodus event that God is accomplishing in Jesus in the way that the Gospel of Luke tells the story of Jesus. So Luke continues, again, with material that's unique to him. Peter and those with him were almost overcome by sleep, but they managed to stay awake and saw his glory as well as the two men with him. So this is interesting because we already noted that Matthew and Mark have these moments where, quite frankly, the disciples don't look very good, right? Like Peter doesn't look good here getting in a rebuking contest with Jesus. And Luke leaves that out where Peter rebukes Jesus and tells him he doesn't know what it means to be the Messiah. And so you might think like Luke is giving him sort of more favorable depiction of the disciples here, and that may be true that he is in some ways, but he doesn't let them off the hook completely because he says they're almost overcome by sleep in this critical moment where Jesus, like this miraculous thing is happening right in front of them, and they almost don't notice it. I mean, you sort of wonder how is it that uh, Peter and James and John wouldn't be just sort of wired with what's happening, be really excited. And in fact, we see in just a moment that Peter is really excited in just a minute, but he's sort of sleepy at first. And you have to kind of wonder here if there's some foreshadowing, some echoes of course, what's going to happen at the end of Luke's story in the Garden of Gethsemane, right, where the disciples have trouble staying awake, and that perhaps we're meant to tie these two episodes together in some way. Again, we've already seen the tie between Messiah and suffering, right? And so maybe there's a sense here, just another reminder that, like, yes, you're seeing Jesus transformed and transfigured in his divine glory, but you can never separate that from the Garden of Gethsemane, right? That what happens here in this mountaintop spiritual experience where you see Jesus in all of his divinity can't be separated from the experience in the garden where Jesus is going to be betrayed and then ultimately be crucified and killed, right? So perhaps there's some foreshadowing here with Peter and those who are with him almost overcome by sleep. But as we go on with the story, we see that they do wake up, and as the two men, or they stay awake at least long enough, unlike the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane who don't stay awake, right? But in this case, they do stay awake, and as the two men were about to leave Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good that we're here. We should construct three shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But he didn't know what he was saying. So, I mean, Luke and Matthew and Mark give us really this picture here that Peter's just kind of babbling, right? Like he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And yet, I think there's a really significant spiritual lesson for us here in what Peter does say, right? He wants to construct these shrines. I mean, what is a shrine? It's a place that's constructed to mark a holy spot, right? And in fact, the Greek word that's used here is the same word that's used in the Greek version of the Old Testament to describe the tabernacle, the tent that the people of Israel carried with them through the wilderness wandering that was the place of God's presence with them, right? So when Peter says, let's build three shrines, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, or three tabernacles, three tents, it seems to be an echo back to the tabernacle that in essence, I think what Peter's trying to do here is he wants to capture this moment, right? He wants to he wants to hold on to this moment. He's seeing this location as a holy place that you might build a shrine to. Maybe people come back to it and visit it so that they can also have the experience of the holy, right? And I think we maybe in our tradition we don't build shrines very much, but I think we still kind of do that, right? I mean, maybe in some instances in some Nazarene churches, like the altar can kind of function that way, right? Or if you had some significant camp experience as a teen or as a child or something, we have these moments that are pivotal and significant, just as this one is with Jesus on this mountaintop. It's a pivotal, significant moment. Sometimes, though, we can try to capture those and sort of hang on to them and make it all about that moment, that location, that time, and miss actually what's really going on. And I think what happens next here helps us to see that as Peter is sort of babbling like, oh, we should build these shrines so we can capture this moment. It says Peter was still speaking when a cloud overshadowed them. As they encountered the cloud, they were overcome with awe. So in other words, Peter gets interrupted, right? Peter was still speaking as he's babbling about building these shrines. A voice from heaven interrupts him. I mean, I, maybe that's when you really know you need to stop talking, right? As if mid-sentence, a voice from heaven interrupts you, which ironically will happen again in the book of Acts, right? When he's at Cornelius's house and he's barely gotten the sermon started and the Spirit descends on him. So maybe he was being prepared for that even in this moment. So Peter always getting his sentences interrupted by divine message here. So anyway, while he's still speaking, a cloud overshadows them, and the voice from heaven speaks in the words of Psalm 2 that we talked about a little bit already. This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. So I think there's an idea here that, again, Peter is trying to capture this moment, capture this space, capture this time. And the voice from heaven sort of interrupts and says, no, 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 Peter. It's not about building a shrine or a tent right here at this moment. It's about Jesus is in front of you. He is the chosen one. He is my son. Listen to him. And I think it's really important, and I'm just going to keep saying this over and over again because I think this is so important to understanding the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's really important that it's at this moment when Jesus has just talked about his suffering and death that a voice from heaven says, no, really, listen to him. Don't, it's not about your ideas of what the Messiah is supposed to be, right? At this very moment when Peter might be questioning, am I following the wrong guy? He doesn't even know what it means to be Messiah, right? He doesn't even know what it means to be the Christ. He's going to suffer and die. What's he talking about? At that very moment, a voice from heaven says, listen to him. He is the chosen one. He is my son. He does know what he's talking about. The suffering and death is pivotal to the plan. It's pivotal to what it means to be the Messiah. And really, I would go on to say pivotal to how disciples of Jesus think about power, right? That, as I talk a little bit about in the video on Philippians 2, 5 through 11, that it's not for the disciples of Jesus to grasp at power, but to surrender it. That to be a disciple of Jesus is about taking up our cross and following Jesus. You'll see Matthew and Mark have this little discussion here about Elijah. Luke doesn't have that, so I'm not going to worry about it. But just one more note here, and the lectionary passage for this week does continue here with this story about how Jesus heals a boy after this. So they come down from the mountain, they hear the voice, they come down from the mountain, and the next day, when Jesus, Peter, John, and James had come down from the mountain, a large crowd met Jesus. A man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to take a look at my son, my only child. Look, a spirit seizes him, and without any warning, he screams. It shakes him and causes him to foam at the mouth. It tortures him and rarely leaves him alone. I begged your disciples to throw it out, but they couldn't." Jesus answered, "You faithless and crooked generation, how long will I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon threw him down and shook him violently. Jesus spoke harshly to the unclean spirit, healed the child, and gave him back to his father. Everyone was overwhelmed by God's greatness. Quickly, you'll see Mark goes into quite a bit more detail sorry, I don't know what happened there. Mark goes into quite a bit more detail here with this part of the story, with this casting out of the demon that Luke leaves out. All I want to say about Luke's version of this story is that I think it complements some of the themes that we've already mentioned. One, that Jesus is here to accomplish a new Exodus, right? And two, sort of tied to that, that you immediately see him getting back to that work the moment he comes down from the mountain, right? So this boy is held a prisoner, held in an oppressed state, held captive by this demon, much as the people of Israel were held captive in Egypt by the demonic forces of oppression and greed and slavery, right? This boy is held captive by this demon, and the very first thing that Jesus does coming down from the mountain is continue the Exodus work, continue the work of delivering this boy from the things that hold him captive and oppress him. And I think that in itself is significant, right? Because again, going back to Peter's reaction to what happens on the mountain, Peter wants to stay there, right? He wants to capture that moment. And understandably so, right? I mean, he's just seen Jesus transfigured before him. It's understandable that he wants to capture this moment. Uh, but there's a sense in which I think the Gospels tell us, no, you can't stay there. That moment was for that moment, but you keep following Jesus. It's Jesus who you need to listen to, and Jesus is about the work of the new Exodus and delivering people from the things that oppress them. And that's exactly what we see Jesus doing constantly throughout the Gospel of Luke, throughout all the Gospels, but the Gospel of Luke in particular, and then that we see Jesus' followers do in the book of Acts as well as they imitate him. So I hope you've found that this rather lengthy video helpful on thinking about this passage that is so central to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark,